On today's podcast, it is an honor to introduce to you the matriarch of my family, Stih7ay Sla7nay, where the river forks and splits. In Nehiyaw, Piyisew Iskwew, Prairie, Chicken, Thunderbird, Woman. Colonial name is Yvonne Wyss from the Khatsahlano family. Both of her names represent the blending of both the Indigenous and the Colonial worlds. We sit on tumultuous lands today. She's a leader, a storyteller, a visionary, an aunt, and a mother today. To start off this podcast, I need to let you know that I'm forever loyal to Yvonne because of the healing that she brought to my family, especially to my father. I am her chosen and adopted son. For these reasons, I want to acknowledge my bias. I will always be loyal to her vision, and when she asked me to represent the family, I always do my best to do so. It is under her vision that she may have been the first to acknowledge the ancestors on Sďwx, the place where the masks are born, colonially known today as Stanley Park. My brothers and I were blanketed there for our graduations in the colonial world. It is an honor and a blessing. Yvonne today is completing her Bachelor of Native Studies with a minor in Gender Studies from the University of Alberta. She has a cookbook called Il Hanal, which means feast, which is available to order on Barnes & Noble today. Links are always in the description. We're planning to start an online store to sell our guest products if they'd like us to. The book will eventually be for sale there as well. My personal favorite recipe from the cookbook is fiddle diddles. Hopefully, if we do good on this podcast, she'll make me some after. We reference another book in this podcast called Conversations with Khatsahlano. I strongly recommend ordering and reading this book, especially if you live in Vancouver, because August Jack honored his people by ensuring some of the old ways are written down and archived. I've been reading the book, and I can honestly say it's a spiritual journey, and it's difficult to put down. Conversations with Khatsahlano is available to order through Indigo. The link is also found in the description. It is an honor to introduce you to Stih7ay Sla7nay, Piyisew Iskwew, Yvonne Wyss of the Khatsahlano family.
Hello, my relatives. How are you? Here at Our Storytellers, we care about your spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical well-being, which is why we want to inform you that this podcast discusses topics that may cause trauma to listeners and viewers. These subjects include mentions of Indian residential schools, assimilation, ongoing harm, colonial impacts, and much more. Our Storytellers recognizes the need to minimize risks associated with traumatic subject matter. The Hope for Wellness helpline offers immediate help to all Indigenous people across Canada. It is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to offer immediate support and crisis intervention. Services are available in English and French, and in Nehiyaw, Anishinaabe and Inuktitut upon request. If you or someone you know are experiencing any harm, no matter how big or small it's perceived to be, you can call the toll-free helpline at 1-855-242-3310 or connect to the online chat at www.hopeforwellness.ca. Kinanaskuman, I'm grateful for you. Your ancestors are always with you. All my relations, Riel.
Mom, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Welcome to your first episode of Our Storytellers podcast. To show token of my thanks and gratitude for you sitting down with me and to ask you to sit down and share anything that you wish to share. I have a blanket beside me that we don't pass over simply because it creates a lot of crunch. Yep. But I will pass over this tobacco for you as an offering for sitting down with me.
Hi. Kinanaskum tanaw.
Hi. Tell the people who you are, Mom.
Sďwx Tanayap. Stih7ay Sla7nay. Piyisew Iskwew. Yvonne Wyss Nisigaso. A lot of the words that I use are Cree because it's the language I understand to speak. It's what I've been learning. It's not my people's language. My people are the people of Sďwx. The lineage that I come from comes down through the line of Khatsahlano. And the Sďwx is living in breathing today in territory that's been overtaken by a place called Stanley Park. So settler colonialism is one of the largest things that has impacted our family, our history, our story, our lineage. So very few people understand and know and are able to connect the dots of where we actually come from. It took me a very long time, decades. It was 19 before I was even allowed to be called Indigenous. It wasn't something that I was allowed legally by this country that we are from to use that terminology. I didn't realize it at the time how much and how important that was. That took me a few more decades to understand what that really is. But I did know that it was important. I knew that it was important that my mom, my Auntie Teresa, her partner Sharon MacGyver, that these women stood up and made sure that we were able to have our rights, and that things like enfranchisement and the Indian Act and all of the basic legislation that's come through in the name of, settler colonialism has brought here to this country, and what it means and impacts in terms of matriarchs like myself. So I guess if you ask me who I am, that's a little bit about who I am.
Start diving into your story, Mom. Let them know.
So I'm not sure kind of, where do we start, right? Do we start where Mary Siemia was born in 1844 and passed in 1905? She was one of our matriarchs and, related to the Khatsahlano family.
Yeah, you know what? Let's go right back. Let's start from the tell me about your family.
When we start, August Jack Khatsahlano was born in 1877. So that was before Vancouver became a city and before things were kind of fully incorporated into becoming what would become the city of Vancouver and the surrounding areas that we now live in. So he was born when his father died, who was the chief of Sďwx. So when his father died, there was efforts towards now removal, and Indigenous women didn't hold a lot of weight or respect or even acknowledgement in times like 1877. So by the time he was probably a little boy, his older siblings would have been taken to go to residential school because the Indian Act was passed in 1876. And after that was then the full-on organization of the enforcement of residential schools and all of the legislation that would pour out from that act and from its subsequent superintendents who would make sure that that was enforced across the country. So 1883, around there, the Royal Engineers were sent to map out a roadway and a little place that they would call and dedicate to Stanley, and call it Stanley Park. It was actually Lord Stanley, same one that the cup is made of for hockey. I should remember the Stanley Cup. Good Lord, I had, I don't know, what, 4 boys in hockey? So, but, it's, nervous tick here on the, on talking.
No worries about it. So, for context, I reviewed a lot of August Jack's book in preparation for this podcast. And, so August's grandfather was Khatsahlano. And in the book, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he details a lot about how the name Khatsahlano has been passed down for millennia over time, continues to be passed down. And then, so just keep diving to the next generation after that in terms of how your line runs back.
So Khatsahlano, when he talks about his father and his grandfather, his mother is the one that shared those knowledge, passed that oral transmission down to him, and was the knowledge keeper in the matriarch in the family. So he was raised by her and by those old people, because he talks about the old people sitting at the feet of the elders, listening to their stories, playing and being around in the area while they were doing things. So he talks about hearing them speak of the old people. He talks about them speaking of our, super beings. And I think she refers to them as our kind of like sacred beings, or these powerful medicine men that we had, these Sďwtoms that were there. And she actually shows him what she says are the last two remaining alive at that time, that they had lived to great ages, but they were very strong. They were big men. People always joke about our people being small people, but that's not really true. Our people were actually very, very big. I mean, August talks about a little bit about that, because he says, I'm like 6'2", but my dad was bigger.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was bigger than him.
Yeah.
And, that type of, those threads are written into all of his writing. He filled every space in what he wrote with, you just have to understand how to read what's the worldview that he was coming from. He was raised without residential school. He was raised in our language first. He was someone who only spoke the language, especially casually and intimately in family and that. But he only used the English language enough to do business, to work, and to feed his family. It wasn't he didn't choose to live in that world. He chose to live as the man that he was, raised as a chief, raised as a man of this land. So he would only engage, and it's kind of like walking in two worlds. And we talk about that. Today they call it two-eyed seeing. We call it walking in two worlds. Both of the names that I shared, their translations slightly different, but both of them mean carrying two roles, walking in two worlds, two-eyed seeing, if you will. So they're about that that way of being. And he was someone who exemplified that by walking in two worlds. His children were raised in residential school. Everything that he did in his interviews that he had written, he actually had verified by his children, so they would read back to him what was written, so that whatever his words were, they were truly his own words. They weren't something that was embellished, changed, or even adjusted by Major Matthews. And that's kind of an important thing to note, because it was something that he took very, very seriously. He took the relationship that he had with this man seriously, and he developed a friendship with him. I mean, there were 22 years of interviews. They got to know each other quite well enough that they could make jokes towards each other and be casual and relaxed. And I think that is important, because if you think about the time period, 1932 to 1955, Indigenous people were not allowed to move freely about the land any longer, because something called the pass system was implemented by the Indian Act, and that legislation meant that they could not move off of their reservations without a pass from the Indian agent. And many of the interviews that were done, it's signed off by J. Ball, who was the Indian agent, and it was in his office in Melville. And Indian Affairs still sits there too, by the way, today. So a little bit of nostalgia, and you may not have picked that up in the book.
Yeah, no, I didn't pick that up in the book. What about August Jack do you think most surprised you as you continue to delve into this interview? Like, what do you think? Yeah, what surprised you?
Well, in a lot of the reading, it kept saying that he was born in Sňwx, which is the old original name for Sňwx or Khatsahlano today. And Khatsahlano is actually the anglicized version of Khatsahlano because most people can't pronounce that. And his grandfather's name was even harder to pronounce.
Yeah.
Because with the guttural language, it's always an enunciation issue that you have going on. But I think one of the things that surprised me, because, like I said, I've been reading the book and I pick up a new jewel every now and then when I'm going through it. But I found a part that he actually said he was born in Sďh7ay. And I believe that out of all those threads of things that are written, it was actually the truth. Because his father died at their home. And their home was Sďh7ay. And his father was buried there. In fact, it was 1889 that they removed his body and forced it to be removed and placed in a cemetery in Upper Squamish.
Can I test myself for a second?
Yep.
The reason why his body had to be moved was to build the road.
Yes.
Yes.
It was in the way.
Yeah.
And it was there in the background when they were taking pictures and dedicating the park to Lord Stanley.
Yeah.
And Lord Stanley was driven there by the nephew, the grandson, actually, to Khatsahlano's auntie. They invited Khatsahlano to that, but he wouldn't go because he was the only living sibling at that time that was... So he was Frank Plant's uncle. And Frank Plant was, the grand nephew. So he actually was raised residential school and, of course, then married into gentry and the next generation down, So when they interviewed him and said to him, "Oh, you're related to, Khatsahlano." Well, and he kind of said, "Well, yeah, my mom was an Indian, but my family doesn't talk about it." So, a lot of the time period and the things that were going on, Khatsahlano will say, "I didn't attend. And yeah, I got an invitation, but I didn't go." When they burned Sňwx down and put the Burrard Street Bridge on in 1918 and started putting the footings in, and they created that bridge, they invited him as well, and he didn't go. Colonialism thinks that once they put something up nice and beautiful and great, that we'll just invite the people we stepped all over to come and be part of the opening and celebration to be inclusive, but that's not really what they were doing.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't participate in those things.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't give his valuable time to it. He had no control to change it, but he surely wasn't going to lay down and say, "Oh, gee, I'll become part of that celebration to show a good front," because that wasn't who he was. He just withdrew and said, "No, uninterested. I won't be there."
What are you studying today?
The degree that I'm in is Native Studies. It's at the University of Alberta. I did my first 2.5 years at Sďh7ay Cultural College. Wonderful little college, local and completely run by the Sďh7ay Nation, of all those 4 nations together. They're affiliated with the University of Alberta, and I have to say that I was very fond of going there because their teaching is all in Indigenous worldview. It was something that was really kind of crucial and fundamental to my having a much better understanding of what our grandfather's teachings were, because I've been on this path to kind of connect and understand my history, who I am as an Indigenous matriarch, and what my place is, where I belong. And it took leaving BC to go there to kind of fully round that out and figure that all out, and be focused to do that too. So, in part that journey was as much a spiritual journey, because in our way, if we don't acknowledge the part of ourselves as Indigenous people that is our spiritual side, then we will never fully acknowledge who we are, especially who we are on this land, because it's integral to that. So, going there, participating in that university was the first time I felt like I had been part of an academic place that really I felt that I understood it, and I was learning and growing from that experience. I've kind of been like an education junkie for a lot of years, and I'll say that because my longest career has been in post-secondary school, as opposed to working in any like in employed jobs. And the only other longer job I've had is that to parents to, 5 completely wonderful human beings, whether they talk to me or not. Because I won't be dishonest about that. The relationship you have with your children is very different with each one of them. So, I had the great fortune to be there for the beginning, and we'll see where everything goes after that.
Yeah, totally. We'll get into that in a moment. The reason why I asked you what you're doing today is you mentioned a little bit about gender studies.
Oh yeah, women's gender studies is my minor.
It was your minor.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you because August Jack does speak about the treatment of the women. I wanted to ask you to speak on that a little bit, if you can.
Yeah. So he does say that he did not like how our women were being treated by government and by men. And it was more specific than just men, because part of the issue was that he saw what enfranchisement was doing. And during his time, so he was born in 1877. He died in 1967. So during the time that he was part of the interviews was between 1932 and 1955. He was so he would have been in his 50s by the time he started to do this, and that's why he was already becoming. He was heading into those elder years, if you will. So he had seen for a long time what was happening to our women. And through the Indian Act, there's something called the legislation towards women was very, very harsh. The intention through residential school was to assimilate the Indian to become a white person. And a lot of the legislation clearly wrote a lot of those types of things. But one of the things they did with women in particular was to not only put them through residential school, but was to force enfranchisement on them by forcing them to go out and to marry. I think my mom talks about her experience in her generation and what that was like. She talks about how my grandfather, kidnapped my grandmother and took her home with him. And, that was like more like our traditional Indian marriages, if you will, Indian, is the way our people did things to communicate. We didn't kidnap people. We, there was a little bit of kind of community bonding within the scope of this, right?
Mm.
So, he had been there all summer long watching her.
Mm.
And those people were watching her, the old people, because our old people were the ones that made the decision on what matches would be there or not, even as assimilation came along and started to separate our people. The remnants of those things still existed because that kind of arranged marriage or that way, existed in my grandparents' time. In my mom's time, when she went home and told my grandparents that my dad wanted to, court her and eventually marry her, they pressed him. And, my mom and dad say, oh yeah, my mom says, oh, my dad forced me to tell him that we had to get married in 2 weeks or else.
Mm.
But if you understand what Indian legislation was,
That just blew my mind right there.
you have to understand that my grandfather wouldn't have had any control within the scope of that. And my mother was just recent out of residential school, graduated, and that was the expectation.
Mm.
So Indigenous women didn't enjoy the privilege of courtship and those things, because enfranchisement was, we do this now and that's the way it is. She was married, given a check for $300 and told to leave the reserve and not contact your family any longer. She was expected to sever ties because she now became the property of my father, which was kind of funny because my father didn't actually believe in owning things per se. He came from Switzerland to be a cowboy and turned into an Indian. So, go figure. He was the one that made sure that a lot of our teachings were shared and saved. And he made sure that he took the time to learn what my grandparents were teaching. And he said basically to hell with the law, because when my grandparents phoned, my dad would go and he would take my mom and he would bring us and he would make sure that my grandparents' needs were met, because all of the children in my mom's family were younger than her.
Mm.
And the youngest was my uncle Maurice, and he was 5 when my dad met him. So those children grew up into all my aunts and uncles, but I'm like, only 7, maybe 8 or 10 years younger than my uncle.
Mm. So
he was definitely, they all grew up. My parents were like their second parents. And then, of course, as my grandfather died first, and then my grandmother, within a few years of him, they died in the 70s.
That just blew my mind actually a little bit, because when I was originally doing that podcast and she said 2 weeks, I never actually really understood why it was 2 weeks. I actually didn't even think to ask because I didn't have any of the context. But now that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Wow. That's interesting. Let's go back to you're a lifelong learner. Mm-hmm. You're a serial education junkie. What was the people's perspective on education? What's an Indigenous perspective to education? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, from the history of education for Indigenous people, we wanted our children educated. Mm. I mean, our people were never stationary or static. They were always working, always learning, always growing. In terms of education, once, settler people arrived and
old ways.
You know, because I remember reading in August Jack's book about the man in the canoe taking out the young man.
Oh, you're talking about Indian education.
Yeah.
Well, the equivalent, and I mean, I kind of was coming around to that, but the way it worked, and it's the way it is, we start with our children when they're very young. So you always kind of graduate up your education as you go. But the story that he talks about specifically to prove a point is that we wanted our people and our children educated in both worlds so that they could understand and be able to, be the best settlers that they could coming from this land. Because it was important for them to honor those relationships, to learn how to be like the people that were coming here. It didn't work the other way around because settlers didn't want to know anything about Indigenous people. They just wanted them to go away. So, the drive for education from our people was a really strong thing, and they saw value in it all the time. So August's story, when he talks about the Indian education, and he terms that because he uses that term, it's what he was, how he learned the language. That's why he uses the terms that he uses, because his vocabulary in English would have been quite limited. So he'd work within the scope of what he was given. So he talks about it as an old man will get in a canoe and he'll take the young man and he'll tell him to paddle. And he says, this is how Indian education works. He says that old man takes the young man, tells him to paddle. As they're paddling takes times. This is an exercise in patience. So he's talking, and he's talking to him about the stories, and he's talking to him about the water and about the different ways of water. And then he's talking to him about the land and how it's turning and where they're going, what that place is, where they get berries, where they might be good hunting. So he'll talk to him and give him those stories and teach him. And then when he tells him, he asks that young man to repeat back to him. And he can repeat it several times because he wants to make sure that the young man is able to understand and give him back the words exactly the way that he was given them, so that he understands what he's being shown, so that he can take that and he can share it with the next generation down. So the passing of oral transmission takes thousands of hours to make sure. It's an exercise in patience. It's an exercise in attention, focus, patience. All these things you have to hear and actively hear, Elders always joke and tell you, why do you have 2 ears and 1 mouth? All those little teachings like that, those are Indian education, if you will.
And that book is full of it. Full of it. I've probably learned more from that book than I have learned in a long time from a book. And I read a lot of books. So I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for August Jack for just having the wisdom to be able to pass all that knowledge down. And you can tell when he's in there sharing in the transcripts that he knows exactly what he's doing. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. He knows
it's purposeful.
He's sharing exactly what he knows he wants people to, the next generations, to know. And he's doing it in a way because he probably saw his people be all dispersed, and he talks about,
removal after removal after removal. See, once they burned Sćwx, and they burned it down in front of the families because the men were out fishing for settlers. So they went in and pushed all of the families out and put them on barges and shoved them out onto the waterways and burnt the houses down to make sure they weren't coming back. The Vancouver Sun of the day posted a massive paper with a picture saying, Indian squatters finally removed. But when you look at the image that's in that newspaper photograph, It's an organized, structured village with homes, and they're all spaced evenly, and they have their, drying racks for salmon, and their canoes up on the beach, and their longhouses that are built for homes, plus their big longhouses for, community gatherings and potlatches and feasts and things. So, was it a squatter's village? They talk about them being dilapidated, and some of those buildings were built in new European style and, things like that. Because I've read a lot more about those structures. Yeah, than that. So it's interesting to see how he presents the story, and then you look in the story, but beneath it, you look at the notes that Major Matthews put in, the comments that he writes. You look at the additions to and other people that are putting in, because if he shared a story with Major Matthews, sometimes Major Matthews would go and have other pioneers or settlers provide stories to him, and he put that together with it. Like they were talking about the last big potlatch that was there, and he was asking August what, where he got his name, how that came. So August shared the story of how we passed traditional names. So he had to to make sure that he had blankets, because blankets were currency, but they were a show of wealth for our people. When you gifted things, you made sure that you gave people something that was valuable and meaningful. And you had food. You always had these types of things that you made sure that you had to do. When you put on a ceremony and you get a name, it's a serious thing. An ancestral name it's a way of walking. It's how you carry yourself. It's who you are as a man or as a woman. Those things are, carry a lot of weight. And they're the same way, regardless of where that name comes from across Turtle Island. Our people, those names are what they say in Cree. We say Nisigasun. It's how the universe knows my name. They may say, the belly button name. That's a simplified way of explaining it. But when you talk to the old ones, those people that give names and how they provide them, it's how the universe knows your name. It's how they know you as a being and how you're here. So when you're given those names, it's how that universe will know you when you come home. So it's important to know who you are. And those names are more than just the GST name that were issued and registered and stamped and, carded and all these other things that we do along the way to be put into the settler colonial system so we can be registered and marked, and so they know exactly who we are, which is important because they segregate Native people today even. They segregate them through all the different agencies that are going on: child welfare, health care, corrections, provincial and federal, education, many other tracks that they have specialized programs for Native people.
Yeah. Oh, and we'll get into that. Don't you worry. Hi, my relatives. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you have any feedback, please comment on YouTube or submit feedback through Spotify. All of your feedback helps us make this production so much better. So thank you so much. And back to your podcast. And can you share a little bit about the potlatches, the ceremonies and gatherings here?
So
they did, from what I understand from the book, is that they served a multitude of purposes and functions for the people.
So the potlatches were our highest form of ceremony, celebration. They were gatherings for the community. They were how we shared our names. They're how we obtained our names, found out who we were. They could be how families were aligned together by arranging marriages. People would come, they'd bring their new babies, they'd lift their children up. If somebody else lifted their child up, those families would come together. They would start to get to know each other, to align. It was how those marriages were done. And it seems very simplified, but it's to protect bloodlines, to protect your family, your community. As matriarch society, our women were the ones that remained where they were because they held the home fires, they held the land, they kept the rights to those things. And it wasn't held the land as the ownership concept that is understood by, settler colonial rule of law today. They held the rights to be in those areas. And they had boundaries. They had boundaries that marked where one territory ended and the next families began. And they were marked with things like pictographs. They were marked with symbols and stones and markers. But our people understood what they were until they forgot. And they forgot because they were taught other ways of being. Residential school introduced industrialization and manual labor and other things that were not in the purview of Indigenous people prior to the introduction of those things. So potlatches served purposes for sorting out problems between families. They help to redistribute wealth. Part of the purpose of giveaways was people would bring and they'd gift, and chiefs would acquire a lot of stuff and food and various things, blankets and other stuff, items of wealth. So the potlatch was a way of giving that back and redistributing it and sharing it with the people so that everybody went away with something. Everybody left with good feelings and love and felt that kindness, that compassion, that sharing, so that people wouldn't all go hungry. They didn't believe in that hoarding and things like that. Wealth wasn't much good unless you could redistribute and share it with your people. Make sure that everybody was happy, everybody's belly was full, everybody went home on their journey and they were able to take food with them. So when he talks about his potlatch, he talks about how important it was to buy, bags of sugar and flour and buy rice and things that were important and repackage them so that they could be shared with everyone, because everybody receives something. It wasn't about bringing them together so they could, stand and honor somebody and do that. When you're stood up and you're given your name in our people's way, you are blanketed. You are stood on those blankets. You're sung to. You're recognized by the people. Your name is shared with the people so they know who you are. And you're coated, you're wrapped in blankets, and you're wrapped in your headbands and your regalia. And when you're given that name and that's finished, all that stuff is folded up, and you take your blanket, your headband, your money, your pouches, your anything that you've been gifted and have, and you share it back. You give it to people because you don't keep those things. The purpose is that, and this is, my uncle shared this with me as a teaching, that the people that you give away those things of yours so that they will come back to you 10,000-fold, because your intent is to take something that you cherish and that you share and that you honor, and you give it to somebody because you love it that much that you want them to have it. So, so you're never going to be poor. You're never going to be without. He talks about that too, right? Like he says, now he says, I can't even go and catch a fish. He says, an Indian can't go catch a fish today, but he said, I can go catch fish and give it to the white guys.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a part,
but I can't feed my people.
There's a part in the book where he says something along these lines where he goes, oh no, we were rich before you got here. And he said, we don't, because it was during the Depression is when he was saying these words. And he said
1930.
He's like, yeah, exactly. And then he goes, what were they taking? They would go to City Hall or something like that, and they would give out, during the Depression, they would give out some money or something like that. Or
like food stamps.
Yeah, something like that. And it's like, we never had that. And I honestly really truly believe that. I think I grew up in these territories here, Squamish, Chiem, Tsleil-Waututh. I've explored many of the territories here, and just reading this book has given me a lot more appreciation for the land that has nourished me and grown up. Growing up, we had fish camp, we smoked fish, we hunted all the time. We and at the time I remember just being like, this is just something that we do. It doesn't really feel special, but with all the context that we have behind it, and when you know why we do things the ways that we did them, makes me feel privileged to grow up how I did. We all did.
Yeah. Absolutely. I look back now and I think about the gift that my father came from another country, but had the foresight to recognize what he was witnessing and to work at preserving for his children, because it was important for us to know how to harvest meat, how to live on the land, how to feed ourselves, how to feed our children, how to find things, how to identify those plants, those things that were common and used. I mean, he would take my grandparents to harvest the fish sticks, the cedar roots for her baskets. And he'd go and he'd do the work. He didn't take my grandmother up and make her crawl into the bush. He refused to let her do those things. He would go, and we went as children with him because he took us everywhere. I mean, we used to complain about, I have to go again.
Yeah, I know.
My dad's going to drag us to, out to the bush. Gee, So, and then we get out there and be like, we're all running through the bush and we're all having a great time.
Yeah.
But we didn't appreciate how wonderful that was. I went harvesting cedar with my sister, and that was 3 years ago. I was in my 50s, and it had been 5 decades since we had been up there. And that realization only came to us when we stood there and we touched those trees and we pulled that bark. And for her and I, it was almost an instant cathartic crying experience. And, I haven't always gotten along with my sister over the years. And I say that, intergenerational trauma and a lot of things has damaged the relationships with my family and with my children. And, it's a hard thing to kind of look at, one, to be accountable and say that, yes, I did some things that were terribly wrong, but I tried to do right things as well. And, then you understand that for us as people, we are a set of contradictions and, multiple choices and all kinds of things that come along with it. And, we learn from our mistakes, because if we don't learn from our mistakes, then we're not really growing. And that's part of it. So reflecting back, you can recognize your mistakes, be accountable for them, say, yes, the only thing I can do is say, this is what I did, but I will do better.
Yeah.
because it gives us that opportunity to be that. And when I look at those lessons that I have learned, like I look back and I reflect and I think, I wish I'd learned more. I wish I'd spent more time when I was 9 years old to really learn from my granny how to weave cedar, because she was starting to teach me. But that was also the year she passed away. You layer the trauma on those things, and it takes a long time before you come back to, you're immersed back in it, and touching that cedar, you realize, wow, I am familiar with this. I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was reflecting on how she was taught things as a child. And she says, even though I don't do them now as an adult, when I came back and I started to do some of those things, she says, it was like, we talk about deja vu moments, but she said, you know what? I think because my parents did those things and taught us those things as children, when I come back and I do that now as an adult, she says, and I have that feeling like it's so familiar. She says, picking it up, doing it, learning it, it comes back just by doing it. Mm-hmm. And she said, she says, I think it's important that you do those things, that you go through those efforts, teach your children, take them, even though they're complaining and rolling their eyes, make them go and do those things. Eventually in time, they will come back and remember that. They won't just remember the unpleasant things. Once they clear that away and get past it, they start to realize that there was more. Because I know I do it for myself. I know I realize that. I mean, our childhood was not ideal. I realize now why my parents moved around so much is they were avoiding social workers.
Yeah.
They were avoiding the 60s scoop. So, I couldn't figure out as a kid, I'm like, why the hell have I been in 20 schools? Because every time there was something, my parents would move. But, I realized that we were probably part of that. I was kind of wild. I mean, at 2 years old, my mother likes to remind me that I told the priest that she invited to the house, the father, that I told him, how are you, you old bastard? Fuck off. I'm like, and she loves telling that story. She was totally mortified. But when you unpack it, I mean, I realized that my dad, the first words he learned in this country were all swear words. Mm-hmm. So his daily dialogue was like a constant flow of swear words in his regular communication. Mm. But what it made me realize is that I know who I spent all my time with. My father. He was house dad, And it wasn't that my mom didn't want to do it, but I understand now that my dad knew how important it was to my mom to get an education. And as an Indigenous woman, she would never have had an opportunity to go to university. Mm-hmm. Not in the 60s, mm-hmm. And certainly not in the 70s, right? The level of racism was so blatant and awful,
Absolutely.
I mean, you listen to my mom's story. She's pretty clear when she talks about it. It's like you can read all the racism all the way through it. And stuff that, they'll call it racism today, but, back then they just don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Right. There was a lot of that. Oh, you're making it up.
Yeah.
I mean, I know in my generation, I've been told I've been making it up too. Right. So, when people wonder why I can be a miserable old bitch, well, I got a zero tolerance policy and that's my right to have it. I've earned it. I am 59 years old. I've walked around this sun 59 times. And as far as I'm concerned, my zero tolerance policy is all about colonialism and colonization and settler behaviors of grandiose egos that they like to live within.
Hi, my relatives. Do you know how to start a podcast? Because at the beginning of starting our storytellers, I did not. One of the things that I've learned is how expensive podcasting can be. So please support us through our Patreon page. If you like what we're doing here, anything helps. You'll get early access to episodes, some exclusive content as well. Again, please support our Patreon page if you can. Thank you so much, Keenan Askaman. Back to our podcast episode. To follow up with that, Mom, though, like, if I could give a piece of advice, like, okay, my dad, 60 scoop. If I could give one piece of advice to other Indigenous youth my age, I'm 24 years old, it would be to forgive your parents because they did not have what we had, and they had it a little bit worse when it came to embracing their, not a little bit, kind of a lot of bit worse when it came to embracing their Indigenous identity. And when I look back at my childhood, and you were my mom since I was 11, I look back and I don't remember a single fight. I don't remember anything like that, but what I do remember is a lot of good food, a lot of good times, and a lot of lessons that I take today. You know, you talk about how you try to participate in the colonial world for 2 decades. I tried it for 2 years. I didn't even survive it. I'm just like still existing in it. It's hard. Even non-Indigenous people who live in the colonial world, like, wake up in the morning, go to work, do your work, go back home, put your kids in a timeout, whatever it looks like, you know what I mean? They don't even like to do it. And they know that there's got to be something else. There's got to be some bigger picture in this world, or whatever. And that's what they're looking for, which is like, I'm starting to like see a little general curiosity from non-Indigenous people where it comes like, okay, like that really makes sense. I don't really know if I can like implement that in my life, but that really makes sense. You know what I mean? But it's like, there's a reason why we did things that way, you know? I said this yesterday on Dad's podcast too, but I am the richest person in the entire world. I really believe that. Rich in the way that I have 3 great parents that all tried their best no matter what. I have food, I have clothes. You know, anything that this podcast or any business that I take is going to generate, I'm just going to invest it back in a culture, because then we'll just invest it back into the people, you know? So, like, I don't even really know where I was going with that, but I just thought I had to say, like, you know, if you can do one thing, if I can make one suggestion, just in my personal experience, it's just to forgive your parents because they did not know and they were not taught, you know. And then when you'll see, you can, like, because I've been back and forth to Sďwx a few times now, and you'll see when you know, did you take those swinging
Therapy?
Yeah.
Dr. Darlene Auger's
Yeah.
wú7mesh
Yeah.
and wú7mesh.
You'll see.
There's a reason those teachings work the way they work, right?
Yeah.
Because it's more than just teachings. They're actually science and physics behind it. The crossing over the brain in that flow of motion is a lot of what has to do with the calming and healing, because it allows both hemispheres to connect through that. That's a very tippy toe of what her teachings do and how they work. I've wanted to learn and know more about it, and I've had the good fortune to sit in some of those, in her sharing that whole story of how it comes about. So much of it made sense. Just the coming of babies and where they come from, and the fact that they have part of the say in who their parents are, who they're coming to, if they're coming all the way through. And they have the component of that. You know, people like to say in Western ways, they say, you know, sometimes these things don't work. And that's supposed to be an explanation of what happened, but it's not. All it is an excuse. It's not an explanation. It's not even an understanding of how the universe works. Especially when it comes to the bringing of new beings to this place, this physical plane, you know. And I don't think you have to be Indigenous to kind of grasp the concept of what that is in physics and just about everything else. I mean, how else are you going to send new beings here? They have to be born. That's how we arrive. All of us do. But we are present and sentient, and we have, you know, we are who we are. I mean, even those abortion deniers, people that don't want people to have them, understand spirit enough to understand those things. The problem with their philosophy is that they think they can control it. And you cannot control that. That is one thing that is out of all of our control. So those beings, us, we're here today because our mothers bore us, grew us, and pushed us out into this world. Every one of us. You know, we always say there, you know, the man's, he's no different than any other man. He puts his, pants on one leg at a time. He eats shits, fucks, and farts the same way that everybody else does. But the reality is we all come here the same way. We can talk about cloning and all these other things, but that's not the reality of what this world is. So I believe that when you start to unpack some of those things, the science behind Indigenous worldview holds up in all the steps of how you go about proving it out. It's just explains so much.
Absolutely. Can I tell you a little story about a baby in a coffee shop this morning?
No.
No, I can tell you?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I was in a coffee shop this morning, and I don't know. Children fascinate me today, being an adult, because I was just one, like 2 days ago. But there's a little baby in the coffee shop, and he's sitting there with his mom. The mom was waiting for her coffee, and the kid's looking at me. I'm giving him some waves and stuff like that. And then he's like non-verbal yet. He's only 1 year old, probably, maybe even 9 months. But he knows sign language. So he goes like, more, please, rubs his tummy, everything like that. And then, you know what clicked for me right then and there is that, holy smokes, like that right there to me is proof that you come here complete. You know what I mean? You come here complete. You're experiencing everything then. You're just not remembering it today. You know what I mean? And then
Which is like, part of the contract. Exactly. It's part of the agreement we make to be able to come and experience this physical plane. It just, it's not a simplified explanation. It's just, here it is. Yeah. Believe it or don't, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change how I feel about it. It's just the way it is. We all arrive here some way. And take a look at babies. You see it. They're old souls. Totally. You mentioned something about, existing in the colonial world, trying to do your best in that for the first 2 decades of your life. Tell me a little bit more about your story and what that was like for you. We grew up in mostly middle class neighborhoods and schools. I remember my parents bought a house in Surrey, going to kindergarten, being the only Native kid. Not doing quite so well at that. I got kicked out of kindergarten. I should have figured it out after I told the priest to fuck off at 2. And then I got kicked out of kindergarten at 5. And most of my schooling was a series of kind of events like that. But when I kind of look back at it now, I realize that, being hit with the chalk and having to, have the yardstick across my hands and having to stay back after school and clean brushes on an old belt because we still had chalkboards in those days in elementary school. I left school by the time I was in grade 10 because I was pregnant at 15, and I allowed people to talk me into trying to make a choice about what would happen. I was sent for an abortion, and then I was sent for Christian reprogramming. And eventually I ended up going to stay with Nancy and Ian, who were my dad's family. I had the baby, I gave her up, it was scooped. So there's my 60 scoop story. And she was adopted by Jehovah's Witness people, which I found out when she was 20 because she came to find me. Mm-hmm. And she was quite indoctrinated by then. She wanted to find me, but it had more to do with health and her sense of, physical well-being than it had to do with a desire to connect. It was a very difficult experience. It's like all over again, having to give her up and having to, say goodbye and do all those things, right? Hardest day for me was walking away from her in the hospital. And she was like a tiny infant. It was never the same for me. I've had 4 miscarriages and 5 children. So between every one of my kids, I've had a miscarriage. They call it a miscarriage in this day, but when I look back and I think now and I realize they didn't leave. There was reason for those things to happen. They weren't ready to come. Mm-hmm. And damn good thing, because I'm glad I only have 5 biological kids out there and my chosen kid. So, this is, it's better. It's a lot easier to have a kid who comes and chooses you than it is to have to grow them and push them out. But they come to me no less the same. Mm. We have both your dad and I have adopted other kids now. And we started to, look at that and realize that, these are young people that that think we have something valuable to share with them, and they want to be part of our lives. And we want them to be part of our lives. They're important to us. Mm. Because, we see that they're missing things from their family that they're not getting, or that maybe their family is not in a place where they're able to do that, or maybe they don't have the knowledge. These kids come to us through ceremony. They don't come any other way. Oh, and maybe through the university. I have kind of a following there. I always laugh when I go into school and I come in and I got to do my presentation, and some of the kids are with me in other classes, and they're like, "Are you presenting this week?" I'm like, "Yeah." Why? They're like, "Oh, I don't want to miss your class." I'm like, "Are you serious?" They're like, "Oh no, we like what you have to say." So it's kind of funny, right? Yeah. So, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, totally.
So, and then I see them now, on the university campus here and there, which is kind of nice to run into to a lot of these people. And some of them I see in ceremony too, which has been even better because being part of a matriarch's group of birth workers Kihuawas is Wagamik is the Eagle Child, our birthwork group that's here in Alberta, where we've been living. And it's, matriarchs and women that have been walking in ceremony like myself. And many of them are birth workers, aunties, doulas, midwives, women that are working with a lot of our women who are returning those teachings back to the land, and who are sharing with each other in those good ways, the ways that we used to, and the ways that we're starting to actively move forward in doing. Because the only way you do something is by doing it. If we want change, we have to be part of the action that puts forward those things. And it doesn't have to be grandiose. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be there for one person who asks for that help. And, we'd sit around in ceremony in the kitchen cooking feast food and talking about these things and saying, we need to do this. And then one day one of my friends says, hey, I want to do a year of teachings. Can we do this and get together every month? And the first year was every 2 weeks. It was brutal because we were all in lockdown. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the year, it was well, that was actually a really cool experience. And we learned a lot, and we were in little groups, and we had mentorships that we supported each other. And the ones that were struggling and having a hard time, the others would lift them up and provide that. So it really helped, right? But it's how we return those things. And we consider ourselves privileged. We consider ourselves privileged to be able to go to ceremonies, to be welcomed into those circles, to go with that group. And the reason we do is their population of Indigenous people on Turtle Island is about 4%. The population of people that are knowledge keepers, storytellers, origin holders of ceremony, ritual, and other things represent 4% of that group. So when I say it's a privilege to be able to go to ceremony, and it's an honor to be able to be part of families that are carrying on these things and doing them, we're a rare group and a small group. And many of us know each other across Turtle Island because often many of us are the ones that are making the travel to do those things and to put that time in. So when a young person comes to me and, really likes that what we're doing and how we talk, I will not discourage any type of input. And I've certainly looked in there oh, I can't do that. I'm of course you can. Mm-hmm. Do you have 2 legs? Yeah. Do you have 2 arms? Yeah. Do you have intent? Do you have ability? And I'm not saying that you have to have just 2 arms and 2 legs, but it's it helps. You look at somebody and say, if you have the intent to do something, then here's how I'm going to help you do it. I'm happy to share those teachings. Somebody wants to learn. I had one of my classmates, she texted me and she says, I'm going to BC, I want to harvest cedar. How do I do it? I'm well, you have tobacco? Yeah. Can you walk up to the tree and talk to it? Yeah. Can you pray? Yeah. Okay, then you're good.
Yeah.
Oh, but don't I said, no, you seek permission. You harvest. You don't need an elder to take you out to the land to show you how to do something. It helps a lot. And you have to always understand the very basic principles of doing these things. But you have to go with your full being to what you're doing for those things. Because you can't take more than you need. You do need to have some teachings, but you definitely need to have the willingness and ability to go and do that. Mm-hmm. And you got to be brave. It's hard to go and harvest things and not feel completely different when you're only 2% of the population. Mm-hmm. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, to build off that, what does culture and ceremony mean to you?
Piyisew. Ceremony is life. Ceremony is the beautiful life. Miyo Piyisew. it means the beautiful life. It means we are privileged to live that beautiful life. It means we get to walk and learn and sing and dance and be part of it. Be part of that thing that's greater than all of us. So, ceremony saved my life. People say that and they joke about it, but it's reality. I think before that I was just bumping along. I mean, I had kids, I had things, I had stuff going on, but I had been divorced, and I tried to bring my kids to ceremony for years and work with them and do that, but until I met my partner now, it really stepped it up to a whole other level of that, because he had the desire, drive, commitment, and want to be walking that beautiful life. And it's hard not to do it with somebody that you can hold hands and walk together with and doing that. It doesn't have to be, it's that spirit to do it with you, because it doesn't matter who it is. If you have that and you feel that, then going to ceremony and being there, and even if they're not with you, it's part of the fiber of your being and who you are. I mean, I remember this first Sundance we went to. It was like, at the end of it, I mean, your dad and I was like, this is the most amazing experience of my life.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've come home. I know this is where I'm supposed to be. And the rest unfolded like that. When we walk the path we're supposed to, things come easier to us. Things are natural and we grow and thrive. When we do things we're not, and we veer off that path, we get reminded. And if we don't listen, we get reminded a little more harshly. And if we still don't listen, sometimes we get just a slap to the back of the head.
Oh, trust me, I know.
I mean, I remember feeling that when I was pushed because I decided to take a job and put school at the side and my writing at the side. And I got pushed and I got hurt. And it taught me a lesson. I participated in my own injury in that way, right? Like, so, because I didn't listen, I didn't take the signs that were being sent to me. And, I don't listen to those old ones, those ones that walk with me all the time. For women, we say we have those 7 women that are with you. Your grandmothers, your aunties, your mom, your daughters, your cousins, those women that are always with you. So those sisters. So they're always with you. You're never alone. It would help if our women knew that. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't become lost. We wouldn't have such high numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Mm-hmm. And other genders. Those are things that are part of who we are as Indigenous people.
Mm. Absolutely. To build off that and to go the other way, my mom, my matriarch, is there anything that you want Indigenous men to know today?
I think it's important for Indigenous men to have confidence in themselves for who they are. We say there are warriors, but there are boys. There are men who have that kind spirit within them, that are who they are, and they're strong because they can walk in both sides, because they know and are raised by life givers that give them all that they need. They have the ability to be sensitive and soft. They have the ability to be strong. and make those stands and have that stamina and hold that line when they need to. They are all of those things. And they're smart. They need the confidence to understand that and remember who they are. Because the way that our people walked, we didn't walk by being the man or the woman. We walked by being the person, by being Iskwew and Nehiyaw. We call that kind of male, spirit, female spirit, but it was about standing and taking the role that was within that strength. And if that man was the one that was, good at wrestling the children and managing them and teaching them to hunt, then that was who that was. It wasn't about whether he was capable of just, leaving stuff to women's work or other work. You do the jobs that the community requires and that the people require. And if you got to put a skirt on to do it, then get the hell in your skirt, get out there. We talk about our Sundance where we have an elder who says that the men wear skirts so they could be as much like our women as possible. And grow our hair long and put braids in so that they can hopefully have pity taken on them. We talk about that a lot in ceremony. Men carry those ceremonies and do those things because they are trying as hard as possible to be like the life givers in their community and those people, those women that they honor and lift up, because women can bring life forward and grow it. It takes two sides to create things, but the women grow it and they use their resources to do that. So the men's role is to make sure they help ensure that that's going to be a successful, happy, healthy birth. Their contribution is important. Providing food is important. It's not a minor role. It's a big role. They contribute to the growing of that life. They have a very vital role to play in that. And they have a vital role when that life arrives and needs the other side of those teachings to be strong and healthy and balanced and well. So I guess when I think about our men, I worry about them. I worry about them not being confident enough in themselves and strong, and to know how wonderful they are. Because Indigenous men are just so much more whole beings, because they can attune and they can pull into that. The fact that you can watch them in ceremony, it always fascinates me. Like, you can take a whole bunch of native guys and put them in to build a lodge, and there's no yelling and swearing and disrespect and that. They walk softly, they're kind. One's doing something, it's automatic. They go over and help the other one. It's that level of community and that level of communal strength is just remarkable. And, even when they come up to get food or to do anything, it's just always, there's this, people move in kindness when they're doing those things. Patience, humbleness, all that stuff, right? You don't see that in other things. I've been to all kinds of event organizing things in all different walks of life. It's only in our ceremonies that I see people working in that harmony and kindness, even when it's stressful. And I mean, getting a Sundance put up and built is stressful.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's a ton of work because it's physical and intensive. And you have to be present. I mean, everything is built without the use of modern heavy things, so much of it. I mean, there's very little actual real tools used. So much of it, everything's done by hand, operated by hand. So, because it's all about that connection.
Mm.
And they're scientific marvels.
Mm.
Engineering feats of remarkable stuff.
Mm. Totally. I always say at work, like, I've seen a group of guys almost not talk at all and put up a lodge in a day, and we can't even get a draft at the end of a meeting.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Not even talk. And I take
They should take all those men and put them on a Sundance ground, make them build a sweat.
Yeah, exactly. But honestly, Mom, like, I think what, and I don't know, maybe I'm not a good worker, I don't know. But I think what makes me a solid contributor in my colonial career is that I see the value in just getting something started or putting your contribution in and trying your hardest. And that's what was just taught to me growing up. We're almost getting ready to wrap up here. So, second last, maybe third question, we'll find out. What would you like Indigenous youth my age and below to know and to keep moving forward for the next generations?
That's an interesting one. I know that when we see kids, and we're really blessed to be part of ceremonial families where they're raising their children this way, those babies are singing. Those babies are learning the songs, the language, the ways. So they're comfortable when they're there. They're confident. My advice to young people, go and learn. Find your way there. Do whatever you need to. And if somebody introduces you to things, go. Take what you can. It's important. And learn your languages. Languages are so important because the way that we express ourselves in our language, you need many words in English to unpack some of the key things. And just going and sitting to listen to those drums or rattles, they're like those first heartbeats, right? It's probably one of the coolest things you can do. You sit on the land, you learn how to do all that stuff. It's going to ground you. And it'll ground your being in all the directions that you need to be a whole person. Because the rest of the world is a rat race. And we're jumping into the middle of traffic all the time, hoping for the best. Hoping not to crash and burn.
Mm-hmm.
So my advice is about definitely finding something valuable in every ceremony that you go to, even if it's the tiniest of things. Mm. And if that comes from being shared the greatest snacks ever, to hearing a song you'd never heard before, or people sharing with you medicines or other things, whatever it is, even if it's small, take something away that's positive of every single one that you go to. Because I always see joy and happiness when I go to them. We do a lot of laughing and a lot of fun. So how bad can it be? Mm-hmm. Don't get stuck in the material world.
Totally. Is there anyone you'd like to dedicate this podcast to?
Probably my dad.
Your dad?
Yeah, my dad and my partner. Mm-hmm. They're and my dad's best friend. Those men in my life that have been really important. And I've had two husbands, both of them in Nehiyaw. Your dad's been my last partner, and he will be my last partner. Because if I die before him, that's the end. And if he dies before me, I'm not buying into another one. He is just the end. And I mean, he's a good man. He's one of the kindest men I know. And he just has a capacity for love that's just so remarkable. It's not, he stands there and does the hard work. He's very humble, even though he's kind of full of himself at times, especially if he has to have another pair of shoes.
Yeah.
I noticed you were looking at his Blundstones.
Well, I thought they were mine, to be honest with you. I thought they were mine. I think he saw mine, went to the store, got the same ones.
Well, that's why he didn't take them off his feet. He didn't want you taking his shoes.
Yeah, sure. I should have took him off his feet anyway.
He makes me laugh.
Well, Mom, this is probably the first of many because we didn't even get through probably a quarter of everything that we want to get through. So you'll be back soon, and I love you to bits. I just want to say that I'm so grateful that you came into my life and that I'm eternally loyal for you and all the healing that you brought to the family. You've been the person in our family to make the hard decisions, to say, no, this is going to be the way it's going to be. Against all odds, people have stacked everything against you, and you still made the call, and it always works out in the end because you are the one that had the courage to bring the family together and to unite everybody. And you've brought all my family closer together. I'm closer with my brothers because of you. I will always, always, always do as you say to the best of my ability. If you ever ask me to do something, I will always try to get it done. I promise. And I love you to smithereens, okay?
I love you too. And I really appreciate you. You are, as I always say, a gift to our family. And you're a gift to me as a son. Mm. So, I love all my children equally. I told you when you came into my life that you could choose the relationship you had with me. Because it was important. Because I wanted to show you the respect as a child coming to this family that you had a say in your relationship. And it's the same with my children. I mean, they can choose the relationship they have with us, but it's always their choice. And I would never take that away from them because I think it's really, really important. So that being said, I again remind you that you're part of our family because you're loved as equal as I love all my other children.
Oh, yeah.
So, and definitely appreciated. So I'm going to enjoy doing more podcasts.
Hey, you're a natural. All my relations.
All my relations.
See you soon.
Thank you so much for watching today's podcast with Stih7ay Sla7nay, Piyisew Iskwew, Yvonne Wyss of the Khatsahlano family. It is an honor and a privilege to get down to sit with her. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I feel like the most lucky person in the entire world because I get to sit down with great knowledge keepers and elders, interview them, and I get to learn so much. So I'm forever grateful for hosting and running this podcast as well too. If you'd like to support the podcast, please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can always leave a good review on our Spotify channel as well. If you'd like to send us any feedback, please comment on the YouTube video or submit the feedback through the Spotify player as well. There should be a prompt in there for you. Again, we don't have very many benefits there yet, but if you'd like to support the podcast, you can always donate some money through our Patreon, get early access to some episodes. We're trying to record as much as we possibly can, but any money helps because this stuff is expensive, but that's okay. Jimbo and I are always willing to put in the work to safeguard these stories and to really show Indigenous leadership in the light it deserves. Keenan Askman, I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you so much. All my relations.